Uh, Next up, Sam Evans from S6 Food Bank. Sam, are you ready and waiting?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'll try and be brief. So hello, everyone. My name's Sam Evans. I'm part of the leadership team at S6 Food Bank. We're going to talk a little bit today, I guess, about how we became a citywide food bank hub during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, we didn't set out with a vision to become a citywide food bank hub. We just kind of set out with an objective to really make sure that no one in the city went hungry. But obviously, when we started, we only had 4 sites and they were principally serving West Sheffield, but the demand was so great during, particularly this time last year, that it became evident that we'd have to scale up. And so we begun to launch new sites, and indeed other independent or smaller food banks begun to notice the benefits of being part of a kind of a hub network and joined us. And so to give a kind of sense of the scale of our activities today, we're feeding about 2,000 people every week. Sadly, over a third of those are children. We're doing that from 10 sites, and they no longer just cover West Sheffield, they're citywide, so we've got stuff in most parts of the city. We're doing that from a 5,000 square foot warehouse in the city centre, and we've got onward logistics provided on a voluntary basis from a local company. And so, I guess the success of this, for one of the better way of putting it, is that through the pandemic, even when the shelves were stripped out, when there was buying limitations in the shops, when all those challenges were in place, we've never stocked out of food. So everybody that's come to us at every location has always been fed, and we've worked closely with partners to do that. But that's been the success of the model. But I want to talk a little bit about the strengths and the challenges and the opportunities of it in a bit more detail. So one of the real, I suppose all of the strengths come from that scale. And so one of those strengths is that of resilience. So there's always been local demand fluctuations at food banks. It's hard to know what you're going to deal with on any given week. And so previously, certain food banks, and I can think of some of the independent food banks who we worked with that had this, would end up kind of stripped out during a session, so they wouldn't be able to provide any food. But as I said earlier, we haven't had that problem because we've got the network between these 10 sites, because we can see the kind of demand across the city. We've been able to prevent that kind of that stocking out, making sure that everyone always receives food. The other thing is that because we've now got a relatively large staff and volunteer team, over around 200 volunteers, there's some depth there as far as resilience. So when people have been self-isolating, during the snow last February, when people couldn't come, when there are those changes, we're able to continue to stand people into those roles. So we've been able to build that resilience there. And the other thing, it comes back to that larger team, and that's to do with being able to deal with crises and challenges. And so whatever the crises is that faces beneficiaries, whether that be kind of a change in universal credit, thinking a couple of years ago, or floods, many years before that, or in this case, the pandemic, that there's kind of multiple challenges to face at the same time. In this case, it was to do with kind of PPE, health and safety, and who to keep safe, particularly procurement and logistics, and all of those challenges all at once, getting hold of buildings. But because there was that kind of depth in the team, you were able to divide them up and concentrate, deal with those challenges individually, and manage to scale. So there's some of the kind of resilience benefits of the hub model. But the other benefit I guess I wanted to talk to was about aggregated supply chains. And I've kind of nodded to that earlier, but we talked about demand surges. But the other thing is kind of the chronic demand challenges that are being met. And so, there are certain bits of the city that I suppose have most of the demand, but don't necessarily have most of the supply. But because we've been able to spread out across Sheffield, we've seen maybe some of the communities, such in the Sheffield Hallam constituency, being able to provide for the communities where there's more demand, where there's more need, and offer that equity where there wasn't equity between food banks before. And with that, because of the scale, we're now able to forecast, the demand going forward. So we're able to overlook kind of the blips and bumps. We've got that data much more quickly, which allows us to kind of manage that scale and those challenges, but also allows us to look at how we do our buying. So because we are now having to buy food because of the scale, but we're able to buy that food in much larger scale. So we buy it in whole lorries now. We're able to palletize it and kind of reduce a lot of the work that's associated with that buying. And that's obviously cheaper, but it's also more green. There's less travel going on. And we've also been able to lean into some of the regional surpluses, which we couldn't deal with before because of just the scale of them. So to give an example of that, we worked with Sheffield City Council last year, and we received 130,000 bars of soap, but we were able to handle that, palletize that, and move that out because of the scale of the network. So there's some of the strengths, but I guess the other thing to look at is some of the opportunities. And so one of the opportunities is to be able to really leverage the expertise, whether that be the operational expertise so far as kind of procurement and buying and supply chains, to make sure that we're effective and efficient in handing that food out. But also there's a real benefit so far as support services. So obviously we want to work up the chain as much as we can to try and address some of the root causes or the causes of food bank usage, to try and address some of that. And so there's two things that we're doing particularly, and they're around debt advice and benefit support. And so what we did is we set up a phone line so that people could call in from across the city when they needed food, so we could talk to them, provide some of that additional support, try and break down some of the barriers that people face when they access a food bank. But that's meant that we're able to provide debt advice kind of citywide, and indeed we've seen tens of people over the last year become debt free. But as we come out of the pandemic, hopefully as we begin to unlock and can see beneficiaries face to face again, and as now we've got these kind of 10 satellite partner sites, I guess there's an opportunity for us to spread some of that learning out, to spread those teams out and those skills out, and to offer debt advice in the communities, and to offer support into each and every one of those communities, and to begin to try and work with other partner agencies to increase that. So I think that's a real opportunity for us to address some of the root causes of poverty, as well as meeting the needs that are faced. I think one of the other opportunities that's beginning to grow is that of regional collaboration. So, where previously there have been surpluses in food banks in North Yorkshire or over in Cheshire, but it hadn't necessarily made sense for anyone to collect them, we're now in a position to do that. We've been receiving food from food banks, within a 50-mile radius, and I think that potentially allows us to reduce food wastage across a regional level, as well as trying to look again to some of that buying and trying to reduce the buying costs again. But so I've talked to kind of strengths and opportunities, but I think challenges are also really present in this. So obviously just running at that scale is a challenge, and although it's a strength, that is where the challenges are present. So this year we're almost certainly going to hand out more than 1 million meals, and so it's very likely that well, it's not very likely, but plausibly that could become £1 million if we didn't manage to get the donations of food, and if we didn't manage to control procurement and do some of those things really in a careful way. So I guess the challenge is, how do we create networks and partnerships that share the responsibility as well as share the benefits? And obviously that's about partnership work. Partnership work is the answer to that. But how do we make sure that as we do those partnerships with local partners and with other agencies, we actually build upon infrastructure, we don't replace it? How do we make sure that the local ownership stays in place? So I think as we integrate supply chains, and as we integrate those systems more and more, that becomes more of a challenge for us to walk through. But that's probably the challenge as we go forward, is about making sure that we build upon infrastructure rather than replace it.
Thank you very much, Sam. Some really interesting comments appearing in the chat thread there, responding to some of the points you're making about scaling up. So amazing work. And thank you very much for giving us just a quick insight into that today, Sam. Thank you very much.